to talk about the view from Iowa, the state with the first presidential caucus. We are so pleased to call on Steve Deace, a good friend of this program, radio talk show host, political advocate, and author of this book, Rules for Patriots: How Conservatives Can Win Again. Steve is Skyping in from Des Moines, Iowa this morning. Steve, it's always good to have you here. Start with this question. I appreciate it. Is Jeb Bush a conservative?
I think when you look at the way he governed fairly conservative, but the way he's positioned himself nationally, which is what people look at when they are vetting a president, I mean, he is anything but. I mean, listen to the clip you played of former President George W. Bush, his brother versus his sister-in-law. I mean, what is this, the Habsburg dynasty? We're going to have an 8th election since 1980 with a Bush or a Clinton on the ballot. The American people really have ruling class fatigue, JD, and you're seeing it with how new faces like Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, Elizabeth Warren, on both sides of the aisle, how they're taking off. They want new blood, somebody that hasn't betrayed them yet, somebody that hasn't disappointed them yet, somebody that hasn't lined their pockets off of the system yet. And if you look back over the last 5 decades of presidential elections, there is a proven formula for Republicans to win the White House. Jeb Bush violates it. And I'll tell you today, what is it, December 17th, 2014, I will guarantee you, Jeb Bush, unless the Democrats nominate somebody who vacations with NAMBLA in Thailand, Jeb Bush is never going to be president of the United States. This is an exercise in futility. Even if he wins the nomination, he will not win, JD, because he violates the formula.
All right, fair enough, Steve. Now, we're going to call on another perspective. Skyping in from Washington, D.C. and Newsmax, Washington, we're joined by Frank Cannon, president of American Principles Project. Easy for me to say, right? Perhaps I'm taking a look at his resume, where he has served as an advisor across the ideological spectrum to John McCain as well as Rick Santorum in their presidential campaigns. So, Frank, let me welcome you in. And you heard what Steve Deace had to say. With a minute 30, are you willing to issue a blanket statement that Jeb Bush will not become president of the United States?
I wouldn't make a blanket statement, but I'd certainly, if I were placing a bet, place a bet on Steve Deace's thesis. I think that Jeb Bush is the kind of corporatist Republican that winds up not ever getting to the White House, and I think that he's probably correct.
But in terms of getting a jump, just tactically here in the short term, with that announcement via social media, does that basically knock Romney out of the mix, and does it neutralize the other corporatists like Chris Christie? Frank Cannon, first to you. We got a minute left. I'll give you 30 seconds each. 30 seconds to you, Frank.
Not completely, but the money-raising ability of the Bush family gives him a tremendous leg up.
What about it, Steve Deace? What about the Bush family network and all that money that Jeb presumably can count on? 30 seconds.
I think it'll be an establishment bloodbath next year, JD. I don't think Chris Christie's just going to move aside. I don't think Romney will just move aside. I agree with Frank. It gives him a leg up. But for once, the establishment will be splintered like the conservatives, and that will be fun to watch, because whenever corporatist blood gets spilled, JD, America wins.
Well, we will see what happens as the battle lines are clearly drawn between the establishment corporatist Republicans and the grassroots conservatives. There is so much to talk about with a possible presidential campaign, and the issues such as amnesty being a hot button. These two gentlemen join us again. You stick here too. More on America's Forum after this. Let's continue our conversation with Frank Cannon, the president of the American Principles Project, an advisor to John McCain in campaigns past, and to Rick Santorum in his most recent presidential campaign. Also with us, Iowa political activist, radio talk show host Steve Deace, who Skypes in from Des Moines. He's the author of Rules for Patriots: How Conservatives Can Win Again. Frank, you hear Jeb Bush say amnesty or coming to the country illegally is, quote, an act of love. Can the establishment pull him through with that kind of observation about ignoring our laws and our border?
Well, I don't think so. I think that his problem is in the immigration issue, in the Common Core issue, and a number of issues, is that he doesn't sync up well with the concerns of the party at the grassroots level. Money can do a lot of things, but it can't buy Jeb Bush love from the conservative base.
And every time that amnesty comment is played, Steve Deace, I sit here and I can't help but react to it. I would imagine that Iowa caucus goers are not going to be exactly charitable about that observation by former Governor Bush.
This comment goes right to the heart of the formula, JD. Every Republican presidential victory the last 5 decades has two things in common. One, the nominee inspired the base in the primary, and two, he appealed to enough middle-class voters, what we used to call Reagan Democrats, to win the general. Well, he's on the wrong side of amnesty, Common Core. He's on the board of a company that aggressively pushes Obamacare. He's advocated increasing taxes for so-called debt relief, the same scam that cost his dad the presidency almost 30 years ago. So he won't inspire the base, even if he wins the nomination. Then you go to the general, you have people like my mom, those Reagan Democrats who are going to look at that clip and say, my husband lost his job as a master carpenter for $25 an hour because these people wanted to hire illegal aliens for $750 instead. And now you, Mr. Millionaire, you want to tell me that's an act of love? I'm not buying that. That's why the corporatist Republicans never, ever win. He's never, ever going to be president of the United States. I guarantee it. It's as guaranteed as gravity.
All right, there is the unequivocal statement from Steve Deace, and that is that. Frank, let me talk to you because you advised both John McCain and Rick Santorum. Now there's a situation, we're getting reports that Governor Jeb Bush sought out Senator McCain for tips on how to ignore the conservative party base and still win the Republican nomination. What's your evaluation of those reports and that kind of advice being sought? About a minute left, Frank.
Well, it just cements in the minds of conservative activists that George Bush, that kind of Freudian slip is going to happen a lot, I think, to this
Sure.
man. That Jeb Bush doesn't really have respect for the base of the party. And I agree with Steve completely that there's going to be a bloodbath because I don't think Chris Christie necessarily gets out of the way. I don't think that that Romney necessarily doesn't run. And I think that the idea that you can ignore the part of the party that drives the primary process is the kind of stupidity that leads one to make statements that are insulting to that group and really turn them out for others.
Fair enough. Frank Cannon, we thank you for joining us from Newsmax, Washington. Steve Deace, thank you for Skyping in from Des Moines. The name of the book by Steve Deace again is Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again. We'll see if they can win in 2016, and we're coming right back.